two of the classic Hollywood monsters were going to battle it out in an unproduced movie, with the granddaddy of special effects Willis O'Brien homing the wheel. How exactly did this Frankenstein of crossovers came about? Well, let's find out. Of course, before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of unproduced movies. At the age of 29, O'Brien was working in a sculptural studio for the exhibit of San Francisco, where him and his colleague were playing around with the figurine sculptures. Moving and manipulating the clay, O'Brien noted if there was any way he could capture these sculptures in different poses, and play it back as if the sculptures were moving. That same year, he created his first short film, The Dinosaur and the Missing Link. His exhibitors saw the work in progress. He fully funded this pet project to be featured on display. Eventually, it was seen by the inventor of the moving image, Thomas Edison. O'Brien was hired on to the Edison Company to make a series of short films about prehistoric life. From the time that O'Brien started working with Edison, he had lost the court battle of completely controlling the movie industry. As of before that time, anybody that made a movie outside of Los Angeles in the US hadn't gained a blessing from Edison would face his legal wrath. But now with Edison's unlawful power liquidated, it illegally allowed anybody to make movies.
Well, I have a little trouble now then.
O'Brien would leave the Edison Company and would work with Herbert M. Dawley on the project The Ghost of Slumber Mountain. With such an extremely low budget, it actually starred both men. The plot featured both gentlemen with an extraordinary telescope, allowing them to see into the past. Dawley would end up backstabbing O'Brien, cutting down the 45-minute runtime and taking all the credit, with only an 18-minute cut still withstanding to this day. But it was through the notoriety of this film that producer Harold Hoyt asked if O'Brien could create the dinosaurs for his Lost World adaptation based on the novel by the same name. The project was a huge undertaking for the animator, thus he formatted his own crew, and his flimsy clay models would be greatly updated to be more sturdy, being made out of foam latex with a metal skeleton. Several years after the movie was released, Willis and Harry started slowly developing a successor to The Lost World called Creation, which was picked up by RKO. O'Brien created a 20-minute reel to present on how the final movie was going to look. Through the intervention of Marion C. Cooper, he had advised to shelve the project, of not only the project's ever-growing expense, but also finding the story very unthrilling and exciting, although he would gleefully suggest his own movie project that would be best suited for O'Brien's team, being somewhat similar to Creation, where it was set on a lost prehistoric island, but the beast that would be at the top of this food chain, of this ghastly environment, would be a giant gorilla. His initial plan was to capture a real-life gorilla and a Komodo dragon, and would have blown them up to scale to make them seem big, but then feeling that O'Brien's stop-motion techniques would be a better alternative to bring the creatures to life. The animal species of gorillas were only discovered back in 1902, and very few zoos had them on display, having the same mystique of an elusive ape like the Sasquatch or the Yeti, and the fictionalized film Ingagi, released back in 1930, which heavily featured an ape in its plot, was the highest grossing movie of that time. The success of that feature gave RKO the confidence that Cooper's monkey project had the potential. 70 plus years later, a 14-minute short documentary about Creation explaining lengthily about the plot was included as a bonus feature on the King Kong DVD set, along with the surviving 5 minutes of test footage. When the film was finally released in early 1933, it was an overblown success.
We're millionaires, boys! I'll share it with all of you! Come! The eighth wonder of the world!
Cooper expressed interest at RKO to produce a sequel, which they obliged, but Cooper was only given half the budget and 10 months to finish the whole picture in time for the Christmas season. O'Brien had very little involvement with the sequel, only coming in daily to check on his crew, just so he had some warrant to earn that paycheck. He was very unamazed by the storyline and script, feeling that it was overly cheesy compared to the original. he spent much of his free time and his newfound wealth with his 2 young boys, which had both came from a previous ill-fated marriage. His eldest son, Willis Jr., sadly went blind early in life. For both young boys for such a strange childhood, it was a great welcome to so excessively be with their dad once again. They would even join their dad during visits towards the Kong set, playing with the stop-motion models. Shortly before the film premiered, O'Brien went through a terrible tragedy. His divorced wife shot both their sons and herself, and his planned income of money quickly ceased, where the initial plan of multiple Kong movies never saw the light of day, as Son of Kong was a critical and financial disappointment. These films would have included a King Kong sequel called The New Adventures, which would have chronicled Kong's journey from Skull Island to New York, and a proposed crossover movie with King Kong and Tarzan. Not too long afterwards, the Oscars offered O'Brien an honourable reward for the outstanding achievement of the visual effects in Kong, which at that point there was no category for special effects. Although O'Brien would only accept the reward if each of his crew members would receive an Oscar as well, since they collectively brought to life the animals of Skull Island, although the Oscars wouldn't appeal to this kind gesture, only allowing a single reward to go towards O'Brien, which that he had turned down. This rejection severely harmed O'Brien's career in Hollywood. People were perplexed that he turned down such an offer. Thus close to no studios wanted to work with him. Out of pity and remorse, Marion C. Cooper still collaborated with Willis O'Brien, assisting on several different movie projects for RKO, but yearning to utilise O'Brien's talent, they began developing a new movie idea for MGM that was going to be the next King Kong. That feature was War Eagles, about an ancient warrior tribe rediscovered in the 20th century that have been able to train and ride giant eagles within a far-off remote valley, a refuge to long-extinct animals thought lost forever, with the finale being set in New York, with the War Eagles doing aerial battles with planes and zeppelins. It was going to be filmed in Technicolor, and a short test reel was created to show how effective the film was going to look. It was during this production that O'Brien got word of a young teenager making stop-motion movies in his parents' house, being greatly influenced through his King Kong production. This young boy was future special effects artist Ray Harryhausen. Through one of O'Brien's working colleagues, they arranged for Ray to meet his idol.
So I loaded some of my dinosaurs that I had made into a suitcase, and he gave me some wonderful advice. He said, your Stegosaurus's legs look like sausages. You've got to learn to develop the muscles.
The two men kept in close regular contact, sharing one another's projects.
Obi told him to bring his work and come up to our house sometime soon, which he did, and brought his mother and dad and his portable screen and ran a bit of the film. I just patted him on the back and praised him, and after they left, Obi looked at me sort of strangely and he said, "You realize you're encouraging my competition, don't you?"
But indeed a thrill that a young youth was looking up towards him. Unfortunately, the film that was supposed to be a big rebirth for O'Brien, War Eagles, was cancelled due to Marion C. Cooper's departure in favour for helping the war against the Nazis. And while we definitely know that there was a test reel created for the movie, as far as we know the reel hasn't survived into the 21st century, likely being destroyed in the MGM fires of the 1960s. Along with many other classic movies that haven't turned up since. The only remnants left today are several drafts of the script, concept art and still images from the reel, along with the armatures that are currently under possession of Peter Jackson. By the late 40s, once the war had passed and subsided, the creative team of King Kong would reunite once again for one final outcome of a movie. That being Mighty Joe Young, with Marion C. Cooper as a producer and Willis O'Brien for the supervisor of the animated effects. And he hired on Ray Harryhausen, which his independent work had flourished after the war. While O'Brien would have a whole work team at his disposal, Harryhausen did about 85% of the final animation. When it was released in 1949, it had struggled to make back its budget, But most excitingly for O'Brien, the Oscars offered him another honourable reward. Not wanting to make the same mistake back in the 30s, he gladly accepted the reward. Now, with his trophy of royalty, studios were keen with some of his movie ideas. Granted, many of them were independent companies, mainly specialising in B-movies, but hey, it was something for O'Brien. He had many pet projects that he really wanted to fully produce, and while many of them never got to see the light of day, he was able to sell a script idea, The Beast of Hollow Mountain, with cowboys up against a Tyrannosaurus Rex. With the exception of the storyline, O'Brien wasn't really involved with this movie project, despite using stop motion to bring the dinosaur to life. O'Brien and Harryhausen would team up yet again for the opening prologue of the documentary Animal World. Initially it was just going to showcase static models of the dinosaurs, but both men were able to push to get the whole segment fully animated, with O'Brien creating the sets and dinosaurs, with Harryhausen animating the models, getting the 10-minute segment done within 6 weeks. This would be the last time both men would work together. O'Brien was attached on to do the special effects of the 1960 remake of Lost World, but over the expensive nature of stop motion, he was let go and favoured to do the dinosaurs, with blown up lizards with prosthetics. Aiding in low-res B-movies, O'Brien was yearning for the days of creating big Hollywood blockbusters, so instead of pitching an original storyline that would get him nowhere, he reversed back to the king that made him famous. He would cross Kong over with another famous monster.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Prior to this, Universal back in the 30s created a rather loose adaptation based on the book. Despite the original novel just being a one-off tale, Universal flourished it into a whole film franchise, eventually with the Frankenstein Monster crossing over with other Universal monsters, with the feature films being far more well known for the general public. Over than the original Mary Shelley story, Universal ceased making their Frankenstein series by 1948, but being based on a public domain novel, the name of Frankenstein was exploited beyond the flicks of Universal. Thus O'Brien saw it as a canvas to freely create his own interpretation of Frankenstein. In his story, it featured a descendant from Dr. Frankenstein, who stitches together different human body parts. Unlike his predecessor, he creates a true large monster that could rival Kong. Later rewrites featured Dr. Frankenstein stitching together different animal parts rather than dead human corpses. As for Kong, it's a little bit fuzzy if he would have either been the original Kong that survived the World Trade Center, or just simply another giant gorilla. Regardless, the two behemoths end up in San Francisco, featured as part of a carnival act. But then through a misunderstanding between Kong and the Frankenstein creation, they fight it out throughout the city, ultimately climaxing on the Golden Gate Bridge. Partially giving a hand of creating Kong back in the 30s, O'Brien was confident that he had some ownership over the ape, and pitched it to the studio where Kong got his start, RKO Pictures. But upon the studio's meeting, O'Brien found out that he didn't have any ownership over Kong. The rights were retained by RKO, and they were not quite the big studio tyrant as they were back in the 30s, come the 60s, so they wouldn't even fully invest into O'Brien's project. Essentially, O'Brien needed to find another studio that were willing to put down the money to license out Kong. Hollywood producer John Beck had a keen interest with the storyline. He's best known for being the backer for the 1950 comedy Harvey. He brought on board screenwriter George Worthing Yates to rewrite and alter the screenplay, such as trying to remove references towards Frankenstein, falsely believing that the rights to the character was owned by Universal, changing the title to King Kong vs Prometheus, then to King Kong vs Ginkgo, re-embellishing some of the assets from the first movie, such as Carol Denham. This was all done without Willis O'Brien knowing. In fact, he wasn't even present when they were pitching it around to other studios, which those meetings drummed up little excitement around Hollywood. But it was when they went international that they got a keen interest from Japanese studios Toho, which starting in 1954 with the film Godzilla, were steadily creating their own library of monster movies, creating the monsters by their own distinct technique by having men dressed up in rubber suits. They were excited over the pitch, and went off to RKO to license off Kong for about 80 million yen. Truthfully, they actually weren't that interested in O'Brien's original storyline, but were instead much more keen of Kong fighting one of their own monsters, which of course had to be their own monster star, Godzilla. O'Brien didn't find out about the production of King Kong vs. Godzilla until several months after its original release in Japan. Unsettled, upset and frustrated, he contemplated suing John Beck for fraud of stealing his story, but he lacked the financial upper hand to do so. The stress and a failing heart condition all catched up to O'Brien. On November 10th of 1962, a heart attack took O'Brien's life. Even though he struggled in his final years of life, thankfully his work and legacy hasn't gone unnoticed. Through programs, comics and books, would document and preserve O'Brien's life work, with his Pet Kong project being widely known by the 80s amongst his fans that were inspired. Despite how he felt at the end of it all, his goal of reviving honour to him and Kong did partially succeed by bringing new life to Kong, with King Kong vs. Godzilla introducing a whole new generation to the character. Toho Studios had licensed out Kong for 5 years, which led to a number of unproduced projects. But that's a story for another time.